So I want to start this deep dive with a quote. It's a list, actually, that categorizes animals. It goes like this. Animals are divided into A, belonging to the emperor, B, embalmed, C, tame, D, sucking pigs.
Oh, I know exactly where this is going. It never fails to get a reaction.
Right, it just gets weirder. E, sirens, F, fabulous, G, stray dogs, H, included in the present classification, I, frenzied, J, innumerable, K, drawn with a very fine camel hair brush, L, etc.
I love that et cetera is just casually thrown in there.
Yeah, right between the camel hair brush and M having just broken the water pitcher. And finally, N, that from a long way off look like flies.
Every single time I hear that passage,
Yeah.
I just can't help but laugh out loud. The sheer absurd specificity of it just catches you completely off guard.
It really does. That is a famous quote from the writer Jorge Luis Borges, who claimed to have found it in this, fictional Chinese encyclopedia. And the reason it makes us laugh, the reason it feels so wonderfully bizarre to you and me listening to it today is because it completely shatters our familiar landmarks of thought.
Exactly. It takes all the ordered surfaces, all the neat little mental boxes we use to tame the wild profusion of existing things, and it just dumps them onto the floor.
Yeah, it's like a mental glitch.
Right. It proves, in a very visceral, unsettling way, that the way we naturally order the world in our minds is absolutely not the only way to order it. That sense of vertigo is the perfect starting point for us today.
Vertigo is a great word for it because you read that list and your brain just it halts.
Because the passage demonstrates the stark impossibility of thinking that way. I mean, we can understand the individual categories perfectly well, of course. We all know what a stray dog is. We know what a very fine camel hair brush is.
Sure, the individual items make sense.
Right. But what completely short-circuits our brain is the alphabetical list that forces them all into the exact same conceptual space. The common ground on which such a meeting is possible has been completely removed. We are left asking, in what universe do these things belong on the same list?
And that profound sense of vertigo, that sudden realization that the very ground beneath our thoughts might be shifting and entirely arbitrary. That is exactly where we are starting today. Today, we're taking you on a deep dive into the hidden rules that govern what you know and how you think.
We are plunging headfirst into Michel Foucault's 1966 masterwork, The Order of Things.
Which is, frankly, an absolute beast of a book.
Oh, it remains, without a doubt, one of the most ambitious, demanding, and just fiercely debated works of 20th century intellectual history.
Demanding is putting it mildly. I mean, when you open this book, you are met with a dense 400-page study of the history of biology, economics, and philology. It is not light reading.
Not at all.
But our mission today is to do that heavy lifting for you. We are going to unpack the massive intellectual explosion this book caused when it dropped like a bomb in 1960s France. We're going to define Foucault's mind-bending concepts of the episteme and archaeology.
Two terms that get thrown around a lot but are rarely understood correctly.
Exactly. We'll trace the massive tectonic shifts in Western thought over the last 500 years. And ultimately, we will tackle his scandalous, highly controversial claim that man, the very concept of the human being as we know it, is a recent invention that is basically doomed to be erased.
It's a huge agenda.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand why a notoriously difficult book on the history of science became an absolute overnight bestseller, literally selling out of Paris bookstores, we really have to look at the battlefield of ideas in the mid-1960s.
It was an absolute battlefield. I mean, if you want to understand the reception of the order of things, you have to picture a very specific, highly charged intellectual climate in France around, say, 1966.
Set the scene for us. What was going on?
Well, you essentially had a three-way collision of massive philosophical movements. First, you had existentialist humanism.
Right, which had completely dominated French thought since the end of the Second World War.
Exactly. Heavily associated with Jean-Paul Sartre. It was a philosophy centered entirely on human freedom, individual consciousness, and lived experience. The core idea was that you, as a human being, are radically free to define your own essence through your choices.
Existence precedes essence, right?
Precisely. But by the mid-1960s, that existential angst was starting to feel a little exhausted. The younger generation was looking for something more rigorous.
Something a bit more scientific, right? What brings in the second major player.
Right, the rising star structuralism. This movement drew heavily on the linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure. Thinkers like Claude Lévi-Strauss in anthropology or Jacques Lacan in psychoanalysis were claiming this exciting new scientific rigor.
And what were they arguing, basically?
They argued that human culture, myth, and psychology aren't the result of free, conscious choices. Instead, they are governed by deep, unconscious structural laws. Much like the invisible grammar of a language dictates what sentences you can even form.
So existentialism says you are free, and structuralism says, actually, you're just a node in a massive unconscious structure.
That's a great way to put it. And then there's a third faction lurking in the background.
Right. You can't talk about 1960s Paris without talking about Marx.
It would be Marxist orthodoxy, yeah. It was a huge force in French intellectual life. But at this specific moment, it was being given a massive, highly controversial facelift by the philosopher Louis Althusser.
Oh, right. He was doing something different with it.
He was. Althusser was doing what he called an anti-humanist reading of Marx. He was trying to strip away the early, more romantic elements of Marxist thought, the stuff about human alienation and the human spirit.
To focus on what? The economics.
Yes, to focus purely on the cold, hard, structural science of historical materialism and economics. So he was kind of blending Marx with the structuralist vibes.
So into this absolute powder keg of ideas drops Michel Foucault with The Order of Things, and the timing is just wild.
It couldn't have been better or worse, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah, because it's published right at the crest of this structuralist wave. It's sitting on bookshelves alongside Lévi-Strauss and Lacan. So naturally, the reading public and the critics immediately lumped Foucault in with the structuralists. They thought, oh, here is the structuralist history of science.
A categorization that irritated Foucault to no end, by the way.
Did it? I always forget how much he hated that label.
Oh, he despised it. He repeatedly, and sometimes quite testily in interviews, denied being a structuralist in any technical linguistic sense. He saw structuralism as mostly interested in synchronic, ahistorical systems.
Meaning how structures function at a single frozen moment in time, ignoring history entirely.
Exactly. Whereas Foucault's method was profoundly, deeply historical. He was obsessed with tracking radical discontinuities and historical ruptures over centuries.
But the structuralist label stuck to him anyway.
It stuck because, like the structuralists, Foucault was aggressively displacing the sovereign, self-transparent human subject from the center of the universe.
He was dethroning the conscious human mind. And that displacement is exactly what triggered the existentialists. Which brings us to the great showdown, Foucault versus Sartre. Sartre, the aging king of French philosophy, actually reviewed the book, and he went straight for the jugular.
He really did. It was vicious.
Yeah.
Sartre dismissively called Foucault's work the last barricade the bourgeoisie can still erect against Marx.
Ouch. I mean, in 1960s leftist Paris, calling someone a tool of the bourgeoisie is practically a declaration of war.
It was a serious insult, yeah.
But I want to pause here because I don't want us to just view this as a petty clash of academic egos. Why was Sartre actually so threatened by this book? If Foucault was just writing about, 17th century biology, why does Sartre feel the need to attack it as politically dangerous?
It fundamentally comes down to the concept of human agency.
Yeah.
Sartre viewed Foucault's anti-humanism as a total evasion of historical responsibility and class struggle. For Sartre, human beings are the conscious authors of history.
Right. We make choices, we revolt, we change the world.
Yes. By claiming that humans are just products of hidden epistemological rules that our very thoughts are dictated by structures we can't even see, Sartre felt Foucault was essentially trying to paralyze political action.
Like, if we are just trapped in the operating system of our era, so to speak, then how can we ever consciously revolt against capitalism?
That was Sartre's exact fear. He thought Foucault was replacing the passionate, fighting human being with a cold, deterministic slide projector.
And Foucault's response to being called a bourgeois barricade?
Foucault retorted with visible scorn. He essentially dismissed Sartre as a relic, a man trapped in 19th century thought who was suffering from what Foucault called an anthropological sleep. He implied Sartre's entire worldview was an outdated illusion.
Wow. Because Foucault was launching a full-scale, unapologetic attack on the philosophy of the subject being that conscious, free, knowing I that had dominated Western thought since René Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Foucault's bombshell thesis was that man, understood as a timeless, universal category, this sovereign subject that existentialism worship just doesn't actually exist. Or rather, that it is merely a recent, highly unstable, and possibly temporary invention dating back only to around the year 1800.
That is the core of it. Foucault is arguing that before the end of the 18th century, the concept of man simply did not exist in human knowledge.
I want you listening to really let that sink in for a second, because it is so incredibly counterintuitive for us today. The idea that man, the human being, was invented 200 years ago sounds like science fiction.
It sounds absurd until you understand his methodology.
Right. And just as a quick note, we are just observing this philosophical brawl from the sidelines here. We're looking at how the ideas collided rather than, picking a winner between Marxism, existentialism, or structuralism. We're just impartially reporting on the explosive context. But to prove this wild claim that the human being as an object of knowledge was invented in 1800, Foucault realized he couldn't just write a normal history book.
You're hitting on the exact methodological crisis Foucault faced. If your argument is that the very foundational categories of human thought change radically over time, you can't use the traditional tools of history to prove it.
Because traditional history assumes a kind of constant human nature, right?
Yeah, exactly. Traditional history assumes that a human mind in 1600 works basically the same way as a human mind in 1960. They just, had less data. They were a bit more ignorant. Foucault says, no, the mind itself, the rules of thought were completely different.
So he had to invent a completely new conceptual toolkit to analyze the past. Which brings us to the two foundational concepts we need to define before we can really start this journey: the episteme and archaeology.
Let's tackle the episteme first.
Yeah. I know the book makes clear it is not a worldview. It's not a paradigm in the Thomas Kuhn sense of scientific revolutions, and it's certainly not a political ideology. So what is it?
The episteme is much deeper and much more rigid than a worldview. A worldview is something you are consciously aware of, something you might argue for. An episteme is the underlying invisible set of rules that determines what statements can even count as candidates for truth or falsity in a given historical period.
So it's not about what is true, it's about what can even be discussed.
Right. It operates completely beneath the level of conscious theoretical commitment. It dictates the absolute boundaries of what is possible to think, to say, to measure, and to know.
I've always found it helpful to think of the episteme like a computer's operating system.
I like that.
Yeah. So when you use your laptop, you don't usually look at the operating system, right? You look at the apps. You open the biology app, the economics app, the linguistics app. But the OS running silently in the background dictates exactly what apps can even be installed, how they interface with the hardware, and what code they can run.
That's a phenomenal analogy.
If you are running a 16th century operating system, the 19th century biology app simply will not open. The files are entirely incompatible. The system won't even recognize it as code.
And the crucial takeaway there is that this operating system, this episteme, spans multiple, seemingly unrelated disciplines simultaneously. Foucault insists on studying grammar, biology, and economics together, not because the botanists were secretly reading the economists or because they were having coffee together in Paris salons.
Right, they were completely siloed.
Completely siloed. But they were all unknowingly operating on the exact same OS. They were operating within the exact same underlying possibility space for what could count as knowledge. A change in the episteme changes all of them at once.
Okay, so if the episteme is the hidden operating system, how do we study it? How do we access the source code of the past if the people living in the past couldn't even see it themselves?
That's where his second tool comes in archaeology.
And how does Foucault contrast this with the traditional history of ideas?
Well, traditional history of ideas tends to look for smooth, comforting continuities. It searches for the gradual, heroic development of concepts. It loves finding the precursors to modern science, mapping out a steady, upward march toward modern truth.
Like saying, oh, this Greek philosopher almost figured out evolution.
Exactly. It assumes that an 18th century naturalist was basically just a modern biologist who made a few mistakes because he didn't have a good microscope yet. Foucault's archaeology fundamentally rejects that.
It looks for breaks, right?
Yes. Archaeology looks for discontinuities. It looks for sharp, seismic ruptures where the rules of discourse change so violently that concepts that look similar on the surface actually belong to entirely different systems of thought.
So an archaeologist of knowledge doesn't dig down to find the roots of the present tree to see how it grew. They dig down and find that a few feet below the surface, the soil used to grow a completely different kind of alien forest.
What's fascinating here is that Foucault genuinely doesn't care if an old idea is considered wrong by modern scientific standards. He considers judging the past by the present to be anachronistic and, frankly, arrogant.
Right, because they were just running a different OS.
Right. He only cares about excavating the underlying rules that made that supposedly bizarre idea feel completely right, totally rational, and scientifically rigorous to the highly educated people who were articulating it at the time.
I love that. We aren't here to mock the past. We're here to understand its internal logic. So to map out these changing operating systems, Foucault takes us on a massive dig through three distinct epistemes: the Renaissance, the Classical Age, and the Modern Age.
And he tracks these changes across three test disciplines: the study of language, the study of living things, and the study of wealth.
Which are three disciplines that will eventually transform into what we now know as philology, biology, and political economy. So let's boot up the oldest operating system in the book. We are starting our archaeological dig in the Renaissance, roughly the period from 1500 to 1650. And this is a world that operates on an OS that is completely alien to us today.
Completely alien.
The fundamental, unbreakable rule of this era is the principle of resemblance.
Yes. In the Renaissance episteme, resemblance wasn't just a poetic metaphor. It played a highly constructive scientific role in knowledge. To know something was to discover the dense web of similitudes linking it to other things in the world.
So A looks like B, therefore they are connected.
Precisely. The universe was thought to be folded in upon itself. Everything echoed everything else. The earth echoed the sky. Human faces saw themselves reflected in the stars. Plants held secrets visually linked to human organs.
It's just endless mirrors.
Representation was posited essentially as a form of repetition.
The world is just endlessly pointing at other things that look like it. I mean, it sounds almost exhausting. But Foucault gets very specific here, which is what elevates this from just saying, oh, they believed in magic. He breaks this resemblance down into four distinct forms, four similitudes that strictly organized how Renaissance scholars thought. Let's walk through these, starting with the first one, conveniencia.
Conveniencia essentially denotes adjacency or touching. Things are convenient when they come sufficiently close to one another to be in juxtaposition. Their edges touch, their fringes intermingle. And through this continuous physical contact across the universe, properties are communicated, creating a resemblance.
So the physical closeness literally breeds similarity.
Yes.
The book gives this amazing example of moss growing on the outside of shells, or plants growing in the antlers of stags. Because they physically touch, they start to take on each other's properties.
Exactly. The animal and the plant blur together.
It even applies to the body and the soul. Foucault mentions the Renaissance idea that the human soul had to be made dense and heavy by God just so it could be placed in the heart of matter, and through this proximity, it assimilates to the body. It's like because they share the same physical ZIP code in the universe, they start to mirror each other.
Exactly. The proximity creates the resemblance.
Yeah.
Now, the second form of similitude is emulatio.
Emulation, basically.
All right, this is a sort of convenientia that has been freed from the law of place. It functions from a distance without any physical motion or contact. It's a reflection, like two mirrors facing each other across a room.
So things scattered across the universe answering one another from afar. What's a good example of that?
The primary example is the human body in the cosmos. The human face, from afar, was thought to emulate the sky. Man's intellect is a distant reflection of God's wisdom.
Oh, like the microcosm reflecting the macrocosm.
Exactly. Or consider Paracelsus, the famous alchemist, comparing the world to two twins who resemble one another completely, where you can't even tell which one brought its similitude to the other first. It's a natural, invisible twinship existing in things separated by vast distances.
So conveniencia is physically touching, emulatio is reflecting from a distance. What's a third rule?
The third is analogy. This is an older concept going back to the Greeks, but here it superimposes both adjacency and emulation. It allows for the marvelous confrontation of resemblances across space, but focusing on the resemblance of relations, not necessarily visible substances.
Okay, resemblance of relations. Walk me through that. What does that actually mean in practice?
It means that the relationship between A and B is the same as the relationship between C and D. For example, the relation of the stars to the sky mirrors the relation of plants to the earth, which mirrors the relation of sense organs to the human face, or minerals to the rocks they are buried in.
Oh, wow. So you can just chain them endlessly.
Exactly. Because of this, it allows a single point to extend into an endless number of relationships. You can logically say within this operating system that a plant is actually an animal living head down, its roots acting as a mouth in the earth, drawing nutrients just as a human mouth draws food.
That is wild. The plant is an upside-down animal because the relation of root to earth is the same as mouth to food. It's an internally consistent logic, even if it sounds bizarre to us.
Okay, and the fourth, similitude.
The final one is sympathy. This is a free-floating force of attraction and assimilation that can traverse any distance in an instant. It draws things together in an almost dangerous way, because if sympathy went unchecked, all things would assimilate into a single identical mass.
So it's like an irresistible cosmic gravity.
Yes.
Yeah.
The classic example is the sunflower naturally turning towards the sun, or water drawing a cucumber shoot towards it. And of course, sympathy is strictly balanced by its opposite, antipathy, which repels things and keeps them separate so the world retains its diversity. Okay, so imagine you're living in this world. Everything is glued together by touching, reflecting, analogies, and sympathy. The whole universe is humming with invisible connections. But here's the obvious practical problem. If this whole system is just an endless spiral of invisible forces, how did anyone actually know what resembled what?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. Like, if I'm a doctor in 1550, how do I definitively know that a specific plant is sympathetic to a specific disease?
That brings us to the most beautiful concept in this chapter, signatures. There are no resemblances without signatures. The theological belief was that God, or nature, would not hide these vital life-saving connections without leaving visible marks on the surface of things for us to decipher.
So there are clues.
Yes, the world of invisible similarity can only be navigated through a world of visible signs.
Foucault quotes Paracelsus again here, who says, "It's like a man burying a hoard of treasure and marking the spot so he can find it again." The world isn't just a collection of objects. It is a vast, open book, covered in blazons, ciphers, and hieroglyphics. This is what Foucault calls the prose of the world.
That's the core of it. Every resemblance carries a visible signature. You don't just look at the bark of a plant to see what color it is. You read its signature, which reveals its internal hidden virtue.
And the most illustrative example here is herbal medicine. How did a Renaissance doctor know that a walnut was the correct medicine to cure a headache?
Well, because a walnut, when you crack the shell open, looks exactly like a human brain.
Right. The two halves, the little folds, the protective outer casing it, bears the physical, God-given signature of the brain. Therefore, it must be linked by sympathy to the brain. Therefore, it cures head ailments.
It's a closed logical loop.
But I have to push back here. On behalf of anyone listening who has taken a high school biology class, to a modern listener, this just sounds like magical thinking. It sounds like primitive superstition masquerading as science. We want to say, they just didn't know any better yet.
I'm glad you brought that up, because that is exactly the modern, condescending bias Foucault wants to demolish. We look back and judge them as credulous fools. But Foucault uses the example of the Renaissance naturalist Ulisse Aldrovandi. Aldrovandi wrote these massive, exhaustive volumes on animals.
Okay.
And in the exact same paragraph, he would mix highly accurate, empirical, anatomical observations of a snake's fangs with reports of mythical fables about dragons, the snake's use in heraldry, and the etymology of the word snake.
Right. He described the venom and then immediately lists all the mythological stories and then talk about noble families that have snakes on their coats of arms. It feels like a total mess to us. Like, he couldn't tell fact from fiction.
To us, it looks profoundly unscientific because we separate biology from literature. We separate science from culture. But Foucault insists this judgment is anachronistic. Aldrovandi wasn't being gullible or sloppy. He was operating with incredible, meticulous rigor according to the strict rules of his specific episteme.
Because in his operating system, language, mythology, and history were not separate. Artificial labels applied to things by humans.
Exactly. Language belonged to the world in the very same way rocks and trees did. A word, a myth, a coat of arms, these were just other signatures written into the fabric of reality, placed right alongside the physical marks on plants and animals.
So you had to study the myths to fully understand the snake.
The world was literally a text to be read, and you couldn't leave out any of the words if you wanted to understand the whole story.
Wow. So words and things are woven completely together in this dense, exhausting, infinite web of resemblances. But this endless spiral couldn't last forever. The sheer weight of finding endless connections eventually causes the system to buckle. Something had to give.
It was too much.
And that brings us to the massive rupture that inaugurates the classical episteme, roughly covering 1650 to 1800. We enter the age of representation, and I absolutely love how Foucault marks this transition because he doesn't use a scientific discovery. He uses a brilliant literary hinge.
It is one of the most famous passages in the book. He opens his analysis of the classical age with an extended look at Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote, published right at the dawn of the 17th century in 1605.
Right. He places Quixote exactly on the threshold between these two epistemes.
Yes.
Quixote wanders out into a new, modernizing landscape, but his brain is still running the old Renaissance operating system. He still believes in the old resemblances. He believes that the signs in his chivalric romance books are woven directly into the physical reality of the world. So when he looks at a flock of sheep, his brain forces the resemblance it must be an opposing army. When he sees a windmill, it must be a giant.
Consider how strange and profound that is. Quixote is a tragic and comic figure, precisely because his entire quest is an attempt to force the world to resemble his books. He's trying to reawaken the dormant signs of an era that has already vanished.
He's living in a world that has moved on.
His adventures are a melancholic, hilarious demonstration that the world of resemblance is dead. The magical connection between words and things has been permanently severed. Words are no longer part of the world. They are just wandering around disconnected.
So if signs and words no longer resemble things in this new classical era, what is their function? What is the new rule?
They represent. We shift entirely from resemblance to representation. A sign now merely represents an idea, and the tie between the sign and the thing it signifies is recognized as completely arbitrary.
So the word dog doesn't have a hidden sympathetic connection to the animal. It's just a label.
Right. It's just an arbitrary label we agreed upon to represent the idea of a dog. It's analyzable, it's clear, but it's not a natural bond built into the fabric of the universe by God.
Okay, if we aren't looking for hidden, magical signatures anymore, how does a classical thinker gain knowledge? If I'm a scientist in 1700, what does my daily work actually look like?
Your work becomes a matter of ordering, of laying things out on a surface. Because signs are now arbitrary but stable representations, you can compare them based on identity and difference. You don't ask, what does this plant resemble in the stars? You ask, how is the structure of this plant identical to or different from the plant next to it?
And this leads to the ultimate defining tool of the classical age, the table. Not a wooden piece of furniture, but a grid, an exhaustive two-dimensional layout of all human knowledge.
Knowledge is now entirely about assigning everything a determinate place in a general system of rows and columns. Foucault distinguishes two primary forms of this ordering. First, there is mathesis, which is the universal science of order applicable to anything that can be quantified or measured.
Think of the Cartesian mathematical ideal, algebra, geometry, the attempt to measure the physical world perfectly.
Precisely. And second, there is taxonomia, which is the qualitative ordering of things that can't be strictly measured mathematically, but can be arranged according to their visible identity and difference.
Classification becomes the absolute obsession of the Enlightenment, tabulating everything into neat categories. But before we get into how that works in specific sciences, we have to talk about how Foucault illustrates this entire shift visually. Because he actually opens the entire book not with a philosophical argument, but with a famous, incredibly detailed reading of a painting Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez, painted in 1656.
It is a stunning visual overture that perfectly captures the classical operating system.
Can you describe the painting for us?
Sure. In the painting, Velázquez depicts himself, the artist, standing at a massive canvas, brush in hand. But he is painting a subject that we, the physical viewers of the painting, cannot see, because the back of the canvas is facing us.
Okay.
He is surrounded by the infanta, the young princess and her attendants, the meninas, along with a dog and some courtiers.
So we are looking at a painting of a painter, painting something we can't see. But the real subjects of the painting he's working on are the king and queen of Spain. And we only know that because if you look very closely at the back wall of the room in the painting, there is a mirror.
Right, the mirror is the key.
And in that mirror, you can see the dim, ghostly reflection of the king and queen.
Foucault treats this painting as a profound meditation on the very nature of representation in the classical age. It is a representation that tries to represent the act of representation itself. We see the painter, the canvas, the models, the spectators, the light coming through the window. The entire apparatus of how we represent the world is laid out clearly on a grid.
But I want to pull focus to the climax of his analysis here, because the big question is, what is missing from this perfect picture?
The actual observing subject.
Right. The king and queen who commissioned the painting, who are the subjects of the canvas we can't see, and who are theoretically standing exactly where we, the physical viewers, must be standing in the real world to look at the painting. They are structurally absent from the center of the room. They are entirely outside the painting, only visible as a trace in a mirror in the background.
And Foucault argues this reveals the fundamental defining paradox of the classical episteme. The system of representation is perfect, transparent, and exhaustive. But it has a structural blind spot at its very center.
Subject doing the looking.
Exactly. The one who represents the human subject who is looking at the table, who is drawing the grid, cannot be fully captured within the representation itself. The subject is always displaced, always standing on the outside looking in. Classical thought can represent the whole universe, but it cannot represent the person doing the representing.
It's like a camera that can take a crystal clear picture of the entire world, but it can never take a picture of its own lens. Now, we should note that over the decades, art historians have pushed back hard on this reading.
Oh, absolutely. They point out that Foucault ignores a lot of the actual historical context and traditional iconography of the painting just to make it fit his philosophical allegory so neatly.
Yes, the art historical critique is entirely valid from a discipline perspective, but Foucault's philosophical utility here is just staggering. He is using Velázquez to stage the central preoccupation of the whole book, that for all its incredible clarifying power, classical representation could never fully account for the subject who is doing the knowing.
Right. It was a flawless map, but the cartographer wasn't on it.
So keeping this grid, this transparent table of representation in mind, let's look at how it actually played out across Foucault's three test disciplines. How did they study language if it wasn't magical anymore?
They studied what they called general grammar. They viewed language entirely as a transparent grid for thought. Words were conceived as representing the order of ideas in the mind in a linear discursive form.
So they didn't care about the history of the words.
Not at all. They weren't at all interested in the dark history of words or how languages evolved over centuries or how they borrowed from each other. Language had no inner materiality or historical weight. It was just a neutral, flat medium for representing thought on a table.
And what about living things? If I'm a biologist in 1750, what am I doing?
First of all, you wouldn't call yourself a biologist.
Fair point.
This was the era of natural history, most famously associated with Carl Linnaeus and his massive taxonomies. And here's where it gets really interesting. They didn't classify animals based on internal biology or invisible life functions, because the concept of life as a unifying, hidden biological force hadn't really emerged as a scientific category yet.
Wait, let me make sure I have this right. Are you saying they didn't believe things were alive?
Well, I obviously knew plants and animals were alive in a practical sense, but life wasn't an epistemological category. You couldn't study life. You could only study visible characteristics.
Oh, I see.
They classified organisms purely by visible surface, features the number of stamens on a flower, the shape of a leaf, the spatial arrangement of an animal's visible parts. They literally reduced living beings to a visible surface that could be mapped onto a taxonomic table of genera and species.
So if I'm Linnaeus, I don't care about the animal's heart or lungs because I can't see them. I just look at the surface, count the petals or the toes, and put it in the correct box on the grid.
That's exactly how it worked.
What about the third discipline, the economy?
This was called the analysis of wealth. Economics was based entirely on exchange, utility, and immediate needs. Money was simply a sign that represented wealth, exactly in the same way a word represented an idea. Wealth was a system of exchanges organized into an analyzable table of commerce.
Okay, but what about labor, like the work it takes to make things?
What's crucial to grasp here is that economic value was based purely on utility and need not on labor. The idea that human labor, which is a historical process extending over time, actually creates value had no place in this episteme.
Because labor is a hidden depth. You can't see the hours of sweat on a finished silver coin. You just see the coin. And the classical age only cares about the visible surface. They only care about mapping the grid of exchange.
That's the perfect way to summarize it. All three disciplines, general grammar, natural history, analysis of wealth, shared an identical underlying grammar of representation. They were all about naming, classifying, and tabulating according to visible identity and difference.
But just as this classical table seems absolutely perfect, just as it seems like the Enlightenment thinkers have mapped everything out and conquered the chaos of the world, the ground gives way again. The grid shatters. We hit the year 1800, roughly, and representation hits its absolute limits. We transition into the modern episteme, the age of historicity.
Foucault's account of this transition is deliberately sudden and violent.
He doesn't pull his punches.
No, he absolutely refuses to say that we just gradually accumulated better empirical knowledge or built better microscopes. He insists on a discontinuous mutation in the underlying rules of thought. Around 1800, thinkers start discovering that the visible surface of representation just isn't enough anymore. The table breaks. They realize there are hidden, non-representable depths driving the surface massive forces that unfold in time, historically.
And he tracks this rupture through three specific pioneers who take a hammer to the classical table. Let's look at them, because this explains how the modern world was born. In economics, we get David Ricardo. How did Ricardo break the grid of wealth?
Ricardo discovers that labor, rather than utility or the mere exchange of coins, is the true source and measure of economic value.
So the focus shifts to production.
Yes. To understand value, you can no longer just look at a static, flat table of exchange rates. You have to conceive of production as a historical, physical process unfolding through time. The sweat, the time, the extraction of resources, labor, is a hidden depth that generates value behind the scenes. The surface exchange is just a symptom of that hidden depth.
Okay, so economics gets a historical hidden depth. What about biology? How do we move from natural history to actual biology?
Here, the pioneer is the anatomist Georges Cuvier. Cuvier demonstrates that the organization of an organism's internal functions, its organic structure, its organs, how it breathes, how it digests food that determines its classification, absolutely not its external visible character.
Let me unpack that. Cuvier says you can't just count the toes or look at the fur anymore. You have to literally cut the animal open. You have to look at the invisible internal engines of respiration and digestion, and those invisible engines dictate what the animal looks like on the outside.
Yes. Comparative anatomy replaces the old surface-level taxonomy of Linnaeus. And because of this, life itself, as an unseen, driving evolutionary force, becomes a genuine unifying organizing principle. A hidden depth that pushes outward to shape the organism.
And the third pioneer, in language. How does language get a hidden depth?
That is Franz Bopp, who essentially invents comparative philology. Bopp discovers that languages aren't just transparent, flat codes for thought. They possess their own internal historical grammatical structures, specifically phonetic shifts and inflection.
So they have a life of their own.
Exactly. Languages have evolutionary histories, family trees, inner logic. They aren't just arbitrary signs we invent. They have a dense historical materiality of their own that evolves over centuries, entirely independent of the humans speaking them.
So, across all three disciplines, the exact same fundamental move occurs. A hidden, non-representable depth labor in economics, organic function in biology, grammatical inflection in language is discovered beneath the surface, and these depths unfold in time. History penetrates the very heart of things. But here's where it gets really interesting. This is the absolute pivot of the entire book.
Yes, the big reveal.
Because labor, life, and language are now seen as these massive, overwhelming historical forces shaping our reality, a completely new entity suddenly becomes conceivable.
Yes, because these forces are no longer sitting neatly inside a flat table of representation, because they're transcendental conditions that impose real, heavy historical limits on us, like the inescapable reality of economic scarcity, the inevitability of biological death, the dense opacity of our mother tongue. A new figure appears on the stage of knowledge to wrestle with these forces.
The birth of man.
Exactly that. Man is born as an empirico-transcendental double.
Okay.
This is the philosophical center of gravity of Foucault's book, and it's heavily misunderstood.
Right, we need to break this down, because empirico-transcendental double sounds like a phrase designed to torture graduate students. What does this actually mean in plain, everyday English? Let's use an analogy.
Let's try this. Before 1800, knowledge was grounded in a transparent order of representation, available to any thinking mind, human or divine. There was no need to study man himself, because man was just the transparent lens looking at the table.
Man was outside the painting, like in Las Meninas.
Exactly. But once life, labor, and language become these massive, hidden historical forces that dictate how we live and speak, man is suddenly split in two. On the one hand, man is an empirical object.
What does that mean, empirical object?
It means he is a biological organism determined by evolution and chemistry. He is a worker determined by macroeconomic forces. He is a speaker determined by the history of his language. He's an object in the physical world determined by forces completely beyond his conscious control.
Right. He is a thing to be studied, like a rock or a rat in a maze. He has an anatomy, an economy, a language.
But on the other hand, simultaneously, man is the transcendental subject who studies those very exact same forces. He's the genius creating the science of biology, the science of economics, the science of philology. He's the object being known and the subject doing the knowing.
I see. It's like the eye trying to study its own retina, or a camera trying to photograph its own internal mechanisms using its own lens. Man is studying the very biological and economic forces that determine his ability to study. It's like a snake eating its own tail. It is a massive, dizzying paradox.
And Foucault calls this agonizing doubling the analytic of finitude. He says this paradoxical figure of man generates three specific, irresolvable instabilities, three doubles, that basically structure the entirety of 19th and 20th century philosophy. Modern philosophy is just the history of humans trying to cope with these three paradoxes.
Let's run through these three instabilities slowly, because they explain so much of our modern angst about who we are. Number one, the empirical and the transcendental.
This is the fundamental tension of being both an object determined by external physical conditions, the empirical, and the condition of possibility for any knowledge of those conditions, the transcendental.
That sounds like a trap.
It is. Foucault traces this from Immanuel Kant all the way through to modern phenomenology. The problem is, how can we possibly trust our objective knowledge of the world if our brains are just empirical products of that same world? If my thoughts are just the result of biological chemistry and economic class, how can my thoughts be objectively true? We are constantly swinging between thinking we are determined by biology and thinking we transcend biology through science.
We can never settle on one or the other. We're always oscillating. Number two, the cogitu and the unthought.
The cogito is the conscious, I think. It's our bright, waking awareness. But modern man discovers that his conscious mind is perpetually haunted by an unthought. The dark abyss of the unconscious, the historical determinations of his language he doesn't realize he's using, the sheer brute materiality of his body.
The stuff happening beneath the surface.
Yes. Philosophy since Descartes has tried desperately and failed repeatedly to fully drag this darkness into the light of consciousness. There is always a shadow. We are never fully transparent to ourselves.
Freud enters the chat, basically.
Pretty much.
And number three, the retreat and return of the origin.
Man discovers that he always arrives too late for his own origin. Language, labor, and life have vast, sprawling histories stretching back thousands or millions of years before any individual consciousness wakes up.
Right, you're born into a language that already exists. You didn't invent English.
Exactly. We are thrown into a world already in motion. The true origin of man is always receding, always out of reach, even as we are obsessively, neurotically driven to try and think our way back to it through evolutionary biology or archaeology.
So existentialist phenomenology, Sartre's philosophy, which we talked about at the beginning, is viewed by Foucault as this desperate, unstable attempt to hold all these agonizing tensions together by sheer force of human will.
That's precisely why Foucault attacks it.
Sartre says, yes, we are thrown into this determined world, but we are still radically free subjects. Foucault dismisses it all as an anthropological sleep, a dogmatic slumber, where we mistakenly think this recent, contradictory, agonizing invention of man is some timeless, eternal truth about the universe. Which brings us to the final act of this deep dive. Because man is such an unstable, paradoxical invention, the sciences built specifically to study them are equally fragile.
Yes, the human sciences, psychology, sociology, the study of literature and myth. Foucault argues they are inherently fragile and completely anomalous. They aren't just normal extensions of biology or economics. They occupy a weird, unstable position because their object of study, man, is also the knowing subject.
And because they don't have their own solid foundation, because man is a paradox, they have to awkwardly borrow models from the empirical sciences just to function.
You see this all the time. They borrow a biological model organized around the concept of function and norm. What is a healthy society versus a sick society? They borrow an economic model based on conflict and rule. How do groups compete for resources? And they borrow a linguistic model based on signification and system. What do these cultural myths mean?
It's like catchwork.
Exactly. Psychology, sociology, and literary analysis constantly combine these borrowed models in highly unstable ways to try and pin down what a human is.
Well, but there are a few specific disciplines that Foucault thinks actually push back against this illusion. He calls them the counter-sciences.
He highlights psychoanalysis and ethnology, which today we'd mostly call structural anthropology.
And why are they special?
Foucault says these disciplines occupy a privileged, genuinely subversive position in the modern episteme. By pushing to the absolute unconscious limits of the subject, investigating the death drive, forbidden desire, the unconscious law, or societies organized around myth rather than Western historical consciousness, they undermine the very humanist assumptions the other human sciences take for granted.
They expose the cracks in the concept of man.
They dissolve the conscious sovereign subject. They point directly toward the dissolution of man as a stable object of knowledge.
And that leads directly to the most famous, most sensational, and frankly most misunderstood quote in the entire book, the grand finale. Foucault wagers that if the arrangement of knowledge that invented man were to crumble, if our current operating system were to crash and be replaced, then man would be erased like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea.
It's a beautifully poetic line, but people panic when they hear it.
Right, I want us to really demystify this. He is not predicting human extinction, right? This isn't a sci-fi doomsday scenario about AI or nuclear war wiping out humanity.
No, not at all. He doesn't mean that the biological species Homo sapiens will cease to exist physically. He means that man, as a foundational epistemological category of knowledge, this doubled, empirico-transcendental figure trying to study itself, is a temporary, historically contingent arrangement.
It's just an OS.
Yes. Just as the Renaissance order of infinite resemblance vanished without a trace, and the classical order of transparent representation vanished, our modern episteme, centered on the paradox of man, will also eventually vanish. It will be washed away by a new configuration of knowledge, a new operating system where the concept of man simply isn't the center of the universe anymore.
It's a profound warning against intellectual arrogance. We think our current way of organizing reality is the final true way, just like the Renaissance doctors did. But we need to offer a critical assessment here, because we aren't just taking Foucault's word as gospel. The book is undeniably brilliant, but it is not without its serious flaws, and 50 years of intense scholarship have pointed them out.
The critiques are substantial. First, its archive is incredibly Eurocentric, leaning almost entirely on French and a few English or German texts. Yet it claims to describe the entire Western episteme. Second, it is entirely silent on gender. The archetypal knowing subject Foucault describes is implicitly male. And feminist scholars have rightly pointed out that man was never a universal category to begin with.
And what about historians of science? Do they buy this idea of sudden, violent ruptures in 1650 and 1800?
Many do not. Historians of science have heavily criticized his account of the 1800 rupture, arguing that he vastly overstated the discontinuities to make his philosophical point. Specialists point out that the links between 18th century natural history and 19th century biology are much stronger and much more gradual than Foucault's sharp before and after schema allows.
There was also a very famous, practically legendary televised debate in 1971 between Foucault and the linguist Noam Chomsky, where Chomsky pushed back incredibly hard on Foucault's rejection of human nature.
Oh, the Chomsky debate. Yes. Yeah. Chomsky argued for a stable, universal, biological, human cognitive structure, a real human nature based in our genes. That sat very uneasily against Foucault's insistence that human nature is just a contingent product of shifting historical epistemes.
Right.
And it's worth noting that Foucault himself later distanced himself somewhat from the rigid, almost crystalline formalism of the order of things. He moved toward a method he called genealogy, which focused much more on power, institutions, prisons, and the physical body, messy political things that are largely absent from this early, highly abstract book.
But despite all of those legitimate criticisms, despite the pushback from historians and linguists, the legacy of this book is just undeniable. Its central challenge remains deeply relevant to anyone thinking critically today. It completely denaturalizes categories we take for absolute granted.
It heavily influenced philosophers of science like Ian Hacking and his concept of dynamic nominalism, the idea that categories of human knowledge can actually bring their objects into being. For example, how the modern statistical concept of the normal or average individual actually created a new type of human behavior that didn't exist before.
It literally made people act differently to fit the new category.
Exactly. It profoundly shaped post-colonial theory, gender studies, and disability studies by showing how historically constructed and arbitrary our most self-evident biological and social categories truly are.
It serves as a permanent, flashing warning light to contemporary social science research. Do not treat your subjects as self-evident or timeless. Which brings us to the end of our journey today. We have traveled from the magical, sympathetic resemblances of the Renaissance, where walnuts cured headaches because they bore the God-given signature of the brain.
A very different world.
We move to the neat, exhaustive grids and taxonomic tables of the classical era, perfectly mapping out a transparent world of representation while ignoring the person drawing the map. And finally, we crash into the messy historical depths of the modern era, an era driven by the hidden evolutionary forces of labor, life, and language, an era that accidentally invented the agonizing, self-obsessed paradox we call man.
It is a staggering intellectual itinerary.
Yeah.
It completely changes how you look at the history of human thought.
So what does this all mean for you navigating today's overwhelming world of information? Why does a dense 1966 French philosophy book matter to your life? It matters because the next time you hear an expert on the news make a definitive, unquestionable claim about fundamental human nature, or how the economy naturally works, or the hardwired laws of psychology, you now have the tools to pause and ask a much deeper question.
Exactly.
You can ask what underlying rules, what invisible episteme is making that statement possible in the first place? What hidden operating system is that app running on, and who programmed it?
And I'll leave you with this thought to ponder. If the brilliant Renaissance thinker couldn't see the limits of their web of resemblance, and the Enlightenment thinker couldn't see the limits of their perfect grid of representation, what is the invisible limit of our current thought today?
Yeah.
What are we entirely blind to? If the face of man drawn in the sand is washing away right now in the 21st century, what new, unimaginable figure is the ocean leaving behind?
That is a question to keep you awake at night. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We will catch you next time.